All right, and we are back here for the next part of Red Mars, which is called the Crucible, because they've made it to the surface, but now they have to do all the really time-sensitive things to get established there. So there's like a feeling of pressure at the same time that it's really exciting. Oh, and I was going to tell you guys, let me double check. As usual, it's okay to record the audio for the Zoom meeting. Sweet. But yeah, I was going to tell you guys, there's two pretty good series on Netflix right now that have to do with Mars. One is called Away. Have any of you watched that yet? With like Hilary Swank as one of the lead actresses. And then there's one called Mars. But the Away one is about the journey out there, and then like all the emotional attachments they have with home and how they evolve as like dealing with a super long journey out there. And then the next one, and then Mars is like, it goes between documentary and fiction. So it goes between 2016 and 2033, and the fiction is happening obviously in 2033, but they have this crew and they're doing like fake interviews with them, and but they're doing a mission to Mars, and it's funded by kind of like a large private industry guy based off of some of the folks right now. But there's lots of interviews with people now in 2016 with a lot of different people involved in the whole process of getting there, and authors and scientists and things. And they're just kind of looking at some of the challenges and the reasons why we want to do it. And but it's cool because you flash forward to the crew trying to deal with something, like dealing with like an equipment malfunction of some sort and having to come up with a new plan, and kind of how quickly things deteriorate if you don't have backup plans for things. So a lot of it has to do with having stuff already there when you land, so that you can not just start from scratch. So I think as we get more automated things, with drones and stuff that can assemble things before you get there, but who can withstand faster speeds or faster landing speeds and everything, because they're not flesh and bone, they can get a lot set up for you. But okay, I was thinking, I wonder if my Nadia voice is going to sound any different than my Maya voice, but we'll have to see. Okay, so part 3, the Crucible. It starts with a typical Kim Stanley Robinson kind of big picture intro. It formed with the rest of the solar system around 5 billion years ago. That's 15 million human generations. Rocks banging together in space and then coming back and holding together, all because of the mysterious force we call gravity. That same mysterious warp in the weft of things caused the pile of rocks, when it was big enough, to crush in on its center until the heat of the pressure melted the rock. Mars is small but heavy, with a nickel-iron core. It is small enough that the interior has cooled faster than Earth's. The core no longer spins inside the crust at a different speed, and so Mars has practically no magnetic field. No dynamo left. But one of the last internal flows of the molten core and mantle was in the form of a huge, anomalous lumping outward on one side, a shove against the crust wall that formed a continent-sized bulge 11 kilometers high, 3 times as high as the Tibetan Plateau is above its surroundings. This bulge caused many other features to appear, a system of radial fractures covering an entire hemisphere, including the largest cracks of all, the Valles Marineris, a lace of canyons that would cover the United States coast to coast. The bulge also caused a number of volcanoes, including 3 straddling its spine, Ascreus Mons, Pavonis Mons, and Arsia Mons, and off on its northwest edge, Olympus Mons, the tallest mountain in the solar system, 3 times the height of Everest and 100 times the mass of Mauna Loa, the Earth's largest volcano. So, the Tharsis Bulge was the most important factor in shaping the surface of Mars. The other major factor was meteor fall. In the Nokian age, 3 to 4 billion years ago, meteors were falling on Mars at a tremendous rate, millions of them, and thousands of them were planetesimals, rocks as big as Vega or Phobos. One of the impacts left behind Hellas Basin, 2,000 kilometers in diameter, the largest obvious crater in the solar system, although Daedalus Planum appears to be the remains of an impact basin 4,500 kilometers across. Those are big. But then there are areologists who believe that the entire northern hemisphere of Mars is an ancient impact basin. These big impacts create explosions so cataclysmic that it is hard to imagine them. Ejecta from them ended up on the Earth and the Moon, and as asteroids in Trojan orbits. Some areologists think that the Tharsis Bulge started because of the Hellas impact. Others believe that Phobos and Deimos are ejecta, and these were only the largest impacts. Smaller stones fell every day, so that the oldest surfaces on Mars are saturated with cratering. The landscape a palimpsest of newer rings obscuring older ones, with no patch of land untouched. And each of these impacts released explosions of heat that melted rock. Elements were broken out of their matrix and fired away in the form of hot gases, liquids, new minerals. This and the outgassing from the core produced an atmosphere and lots of water. There were clouds, storms, rain and snow, glaciers, streams, rivers, lakes, all scouring the land, all leaving unmistakable marks of their passage. Flood channels, stream beds, shorelines, every kind of hydrologic hieroglyphic. But all that went away. The planet was too small, too far from the sun. The atmosphere froze and fell to the ground. Carbon dioxide sublimed to form a thin new atmosphere, while oxygen bonded to rock and turned it red. The water froze, and over the ages seeped down through the kilometers of meteor-broken rock. Eventually, this layer of regolith became permeated with ice, and the deepest parts were hot enough to melt the ice. So there were underground seas on Mars. Water always flows downhill, so these aquifers migrated down, slowly seeping until they pooled behind some stoppage or another, a rib of high bedrock or a frozen soil barrier. Sometimes intense artesian pressures built against these dams, and sometimes a meteor would hit or a volcano appear, and the dam would burst apart, and a whole underground sea would spew over the landscape in enormous floods 10,000 times the flow of the Mississippi. Eventually, however, the water on the surface would freeze and sublime away in the ceaseless dry winds and fall on the poles in every winter's fog hood. The polar caps therefore thickened, and their weight drove the ice underground until the visible ice was only the tip of 2 world-topping lenses of underground permafrost, lenses 10 and then 100 times the visible cap's volume. While back down toward the equator, new aquifers were being filled from below by outgassing from the core, and some of the old aquifers were refilling. And so this slowest of cycles approached its second round. But as the planet was cooling, all of it happened more and more slowly, in a long retard like a clock winding down. The planet settled into the shape we see, but change never stops. The ceaseless winds carved the land with dust that grew finer and finer, and the eccentricities of Mars' orbit meant that the southern and northern hemispheres traded the cold and warm winters in a cycle of 51,000 years, so that the dry ice cap and the water ice cap reversed poles. Each swing of this pendulum laid down a new stratum of sand, and the troughs of new dunes cut through older layers at an angle, until the sand around the poles lay in a stippled cross-hatching in geometrical patterns like Navajo sand paintings, banding the whole top of the world. The colored sands and their patterns, the fluted and scalloped canyon walls, the volcanoes rising right through the sky, the rubbled rock of the chaotic terrain, the infinity of craters, ringed emblems of the planet's beginning. Beautiful or harsher than that, spare, austere, stripped down, silent, stoic, rocky and changeless, sublime, the visible language of nature's mineral existence. Mineral, not animal, nor vegetable, nor viral. It could have happened, but it didn't. There was never any spontaneous generation out of the clays or the sulfuric hot springs, no spore falling out of space, no touch of a god. Whatever starts life, for we do not know, it did not happen on Mars. Mars rolled, proof of the otherness of the world, of its stony vitality. And then, one day, she hit the ground with both feet solid. Nothing tricky about it. The G familiar from 9 months in the Aries, and with the suit's weight, not that much different from walking on Earth, as far as she could remember. The sky was a pink shaded with sandy tans, a color richer and more subtle than any in the photos. "Look at the sky," Anne was saying. "Look at the sky." Maya was chattering away. Sax and Vlad spun like rotating statues. Nadezhda Francine Chernyshevsky took a few more steps. Nadezhda Francine Chernyshevsky took a few more steps, felt her boots crunch the surface. It was salt-hardened sand, a couple of centimeters thick, which cracked when you walked on it. The geologists called it duracrust, or caliche. Her boot tracks were surrounded by small systems of radial fractures. She was out away from the lander. The ground was a dark, rusty orange, covered with an even litter of rocks the same color, although some of the rocks showed tints of red or black or yellow. To the east stood a number of rocket landing vehicles, each one a different shape and size, with the tops of more sticking over the eastern horizon. All of them were crusted the same red-orange as the ground. It was an odd, thrilling sight, as if they had stumbled upon a long-abandoned alien spaceport. Parts of Baikonur would look like this in a million years. She walked to one of the nearest landing vehicles, a freight container the size of a small house, set on a skeletal four-legged rocket assembly. It looked like it had been there for decades. The sun was overhead, too bright to look at even through her faceplate. It was hard to judge through the polarization and other filters, but it seemed to her that the daylight was much like that on Earth, as far as she could remember. A bright winter's day. She looked around again, trying to take it all in. They stood on a gently bumpy plain, covered with small, sharp-edged rocks, all half buried in dust. Back to the west, the horizon was marked by a small, flat-topped hill. It might be a crater rim. It was hard to say. Anne was already halfway there, still quite a large figure. The horizon was closer than seemed right. And Nadia paused to take note of that, suspecting that she would soon become accustomed to it, and never notice. But it was not Earth-like, that strangely close horizon. She saw that clearly now. They stood on a smaller planet. She made a concerted effort to recall Earth's gravity, wondering that it should be so hard. walking in the woods, over tundra, on the river ice in winter. And now, step, step, the ground was flat, but one had to thread a course between the ubiquitous rocks. There was no place on earth that she knew of where they were distributed so copiously and evenly. Take a jump. She did, and laughed. Even with her suit on, she could tell she was lighter. She was just as strong as ever, but weighed only 30 kilos. And the 40 kilos of the suit, well, it threw her off balance, that was true. It made her feel that she had gone hollow. That was it. Her center of gravity was gone. Her weight had been shifted out to her skin, to the outside of her muscles rather than the inside. That was the effect of the suit, of course. Inside the habitats, it would be as it had been in the Ares, but out here in a suit, she was the hollow woman. With the aid of that image, she could suddenly move more easily, hop over a boulder, come down and take a turn, dance. Simply pop in the air, dance, land on top of a flat rock. Watch out! She tumbled, landed on a knee and both hands. Her gloves broke through the duracrust. It felt like a layer of caked sand at the beach, only harder and more brittle, like hardened mud, and cold. Their gloves weren't heated the way their boot soles were, and there wasn't enough insulation when actually touching the ground. It was like touching ice with the bare fingers. Wow. Around 215 degrees Kelvin, she recalled, or minus 90 degrees centigrade. Colder than Antarctica, colder than Siberia at its worst. Her fingertips were numb. They would need better gloves to be able to work, gloves fitted with heating elements like their boot soles. That would make the gloves thicker and less flexible. She'd have to get her finger muscles back into shape. She had been laughing. She stood and walked to another freight drop, humming Royal Garden blues. She climbed the leg of the next drop and rubbed the crust of red dirt off an engraved manifest on the side of the big metal crate. One John Deere Volvo Martian bulldozer, hydrazine-powered, thermally protected, semi-autonomous, fully programmable. Prostheses and spare parts included. She felt her face stretched in a big grin. Backhoes, front loaders, bulldozers, tractors, graders, dump trucks, construction supplies, and materials of every kind. Air miners to filter and collect chemicals from the atmosphere. Little factories to render these chemicals into other chemicals. Other factories to combine those chemicals. A whole commissary. Everything they were going to need, all at hand, and scores of crates scattered over the plain. She began to hop from one lander to the next, taking stock. Some of them had obviously hit hard. Some had their spider legs collapsed. Others their bodies cracked. One was even flattened into a pile of smashed boxes, half buried in dust. But these were just another kind of opportunity. The salvage and repair game, one of her favorites. She laughed aloud. She was a bit giddy. She noticed the comm light on her wrist console blinking. She switched to the comm in hand and was startled by Maya and Vlad and Sax all talking at once. "Where's Anne? You women get back here." "Hey Nadia, come help us with this get this damned habitat online. We can't even get the door open." She laughed. The habitats were scattered like everything else, but they had landed near one that they knew was functional. It had been turned on from orbit some days before and run through a complete check. Unfortunately, the outer lock door could not be included in the check, and it was stuck. Nadia went to work on it, grinning. It was odd to see what looked like a derelict trailer home sporting a space station lock door. It only took a minute for her to get it open, by tapping out the emergency open code while pulling out on the door. Stuck with cold, differential shrinking perhaps. They're going to have a lot of little problems like that. Then she and Vlad were into the lock and then inside the habitat. It still looked like a trailer home, but with the latest in kitchen fixtures. All the lights were on. The air was warm and circulating well. The control panel looked like a nuclear power plant. While the others came inside, Nadia walked down a row of small rooms, through door after door, and the oddest feeling suddenly came over her. Things seemed out of place. The lights were on, some of them blinking, and down at the far end of the hall, a door was swinging slightly back and forth on its hinges. Obviously the ventilation, and the shock of the habitat's landing probably had disarranged things slightly. She shook off the feeling and went back to greet the others. By the time everyone had landed and walked across the stony plain, stopping, stumbling, running, staring off at the horizon, spinning slowly, walking again, and had entered into the 3 functioning habitats and gotten out of their EVA suits and put them away and checked out the habitats and eaten a bit, talking it all over the whole while, night had fallen. They continued working on the habitats and talking through most of that night, too excited to fall asleep. Then most of them slept in snatches until dawn, when they woke and suited up and went out again, looking around and checking manifests and running machines through checks. Eventually they noticed they were famished and went back in to jam down a quick meal, and then it was night again. And that was what it was like for several days, a wild swirl of time passing. Nadia would wake to the beep of her wrist console, and eat a quick breakfast looking out the habitat's little east window. Dawn stained the sky rich berry colors for a few minutes, before shifting rapidly through a series of rosy tones to the thick pink-orange of daytime. All over the floor of the habitat her companions slept, on mattresses that would fold up against the wall during the day. The walls were beige, tinted orange by the dawn. The kitchen and living room were tiny, the 4 toilet rooms no more than closets. Anne would stir as the room lightened and go to one of the 4 toilets. John was already in the kitchen, moving around quietly. Conditions were so much more crowded and public than they had been on the Aries that some of them were having trouble adjusting. Every night Maya complained she couldn't sleep in such a crowd, but there she was, mouth open girlishly. She would be the last to rise, snoozing through the noise and bustle of the others' morning routines. Then the sun would crack the horizon, and Nadia would be done with her cereal and milk, the milk made of powder mixed with water mined from the atmosphere. It tasted just the same. And it was time to get into her walker and out to work. The walkers were designed for the Martian surface and were not pressurized like spacesuits, but were rather made of an elastic mesh which held in the body at about the same pressure that the Terran atmosphere would have. This prevented the severe expansion bruising that would result if skin were exposed to Mars's minimal atmosphere, but it gave the wearer a lot more freedom of movement than a pressurized spacesuit would have. Walkers also had the very significant advantage of being fail operational. Only the hard helmet was airtight, so if you ripped a hole at knee or elbow, you would have a badly bruised and frozen patch of skin, but would not suffocate and die within minutes. Getting into the walker, however, was a workout in itself. Nadia wriggled the pants over her long underwear, then got in the jacket and zipped the 2 sections of the suit together. After that, she jammed into big thermal boots and locked their top rings to the suit's ankle rings, pulled on gloves, and locked the wrist rings, put on a fairly standard hard helmet, and locked it to the suit's neck ring. then shouldered into an air tank backpack and linked its air tubes to her helmet. She breathed hard a few times, tasting the cool oxygen nitrogen in her face. The walker's wrist pad indicated that all the seals were good, and she followed John and Samantha into the lock. They closed the inner door, the air was sucked back into containers, and John unlocked the outer door. The three of them stepped outside. It was a thrill every morning to step out onto the rocky plain, with the early morning sun casting long black shadows to the west, and the various small knolls and hollows revealed clearly. There was usually a wind from the south, and loose fines moved in a sinuous flow over the ground, so that the rocks sometimes seemed to creep. Even the strongest of these winds could scarcely be felt against an outstretched hand, but they hadn't yet experienced one of the storm winds. At 500 kilometers per hour, they were pretty sure to feel something. At 20, nearly nothing. Nadia and Samantha walked over to one of the little rovers they had uncrated and climbed in. Nadia drove the rover across the plain to a tractor they had found the day before, about a kilometer to the west. The morning cold cut through her walker in a diamond pattern as the result of the X-weave of the heating filaments in the suit material. A strange sensation, but she had been colder in Siberia many a time, and she had no complaints. They came to the big lander and got out. Nadia picked up a drill with a Phillips screwdriver bit and started dismantling the crate on top of the vehicle. The tractor inside the lander's crate was a Mercedes-Benz. She poked the drill into the head of a screw, pulled the trigger, and watched the screw spin out. She picked up the screw and moved to the next, grinning. Innumerable times in her youth she had gone out in cold like this, with numb, white, chopped-up hands, and fought titanic battles to unscrew frozen or stripped screws. But here it was zip, another one out. And really with the walker it was warmer than it had been in Siberia, and freer than in space. The walker no more restrictive than a thin, stiff wetsuit. Red rocks were scattered all around in their uncanny regularity. Voices chattered on the common band. "Hey, I found those solar panels." "You think that's something? I just found the goddamn nuclear reactor." Yes, it was a good morning on Mars. The stacked crate walls made a ramp to drive the tractor off the lander. They didn't look strong enough, but that was the gravity again. Nadia had turned on the tractor's heating system as soon as she could reach it, and now she climbed into the cab and tapped a command into its autopilot, feeling that it would be best to let the thing descend the ramp on its own, with her and Samantha watching from the side, just in case the ramp was more brittle in the cold than expected, or otherwise unreliable. She still found it almost impossible to think in terms of Martian G, to trust the designs that took it into account. The ramp just looked too flimsy. But the tractor rolled down without incident and stopped on the ground, 8 meters long, royal blue, with wire mesh wheels taller than they were. They had to climb a short ladder into the cab. The crane prosthesis was already attached to the mount on the front end, and that made it easy to load the tractor with the winch, the sandbagger, the boxes of spare parts, and finally the crate walls. When they were done, the tractor looked as overloaded and top-heavy as a steam calliope, but the G made it only a matter of balance. The tractor itself was a real pig with 600 horsepower, you have to say that horsepower in a southern accent, I think. The tractor itself was a real pig with 600 horsepower, a wide wheelbase and wheels big as tracks. The hydrazine motor had pickup even worse than diesel, but it was like the ultimate first gear, completely inexorable. They took off and rolled slowly toward the trailer park. And there she was, Nadezhda Chernyshevsky, driving a Mercedes-Benz across Mars. She followed Samantha to the sorting lot, feeling like a queen. And that was the morning. Back into the habitat, helmet and tank off, a quick bite in walker and boots. With all that running around, they were famished. After lunch, they went back out in the Mercedes-Benz and used it to haul a Boeing air miner to an area east of the habitats, where they were going to gather all the factories. The air miners were big metal cylinders, somewhat resembling 737 fuselages, except that they had 8 massive sets of landing gear and rocket engines attached vertically to their sides, and 2 jet engines mounted above the fuselage fore and aft. 5 of these miners had been dropped in the area some 2 years before. In the time since, their jet engines had been sucking in the thin air and ramming it through a sequence of separating mechanisms to divide it into its component gases. The gases had been compressed and stored in big tanks and were now available for use. So the Boeings each now held 5,000 liters of water ice, 3,000 liters of liquid oxygen, 3,000 liters of liquid nitrogen, 500 liters of argon, and 400 liters of carbon dioxide. It was no easy task hauling these giants across the rubble to the big holding tanks near their habitats, but they needed to do it, because after they were drained into the holding tanks, they could be turned on again. Just that afternoon, another group had gotten one emptied out and turned back on, and the low hum of its jets could be heard everywhere, even in a helmet or a habitat. Nadia and Samantha's miner was more stubborn, and the whole afternoon they had only managed to haul it 100 meters, and they had to use the bulldozer attachment to scrape a rough road for it all the way. Just before sunset, they returned through the lock into the habitat, their hands cold and aching with fatigue. They stripped down to their dust-caked underwear and went straight to the kitchen, ravenous once more. Vlad estimated they were each burning about 6,000 calories a day. They cooked and gulped down rehydrated pasta, nearly scalding their partially thawed fingers on their trays. Only when they had finished eating did they go to the women's changing room and start trying to clean themselves up, sponging down with hot water, changing into clean jumpers. It's going to be hard to keep our clothes clean. That dust even gets through the wrist locks, and the waist zippers are like open holes. Well, yeah, those fines are micron-sized. We're going to have worse trouble from it than dirty clothes, I can tell you that. It's going to be getting into everything, our lungs, our blood, our brains. When they say fines, they're talking about like the really fine particles, the dust particles. That's life on Mars. This was already a popular refrain, used whenever they encountered a problem, especially an intractable one. On some days after dinner, there were a couple hours of sunlight left, and Nadia, restless, would sometimes go back outside. Often she spent the time wandering around the crates that had been hauled to base that day, and over time she assembled a personal toolkit, feeling like a kid in a candy store. Years in the Siberian power industry had given her a reverence for good tools. She had suffered brutally from the lack of them. Everything in North Yakut had been built on permafrost, and the platforms sank unevenly in the summer and were buried in ice in the winter, and parts for construction had come from all over the world. Heavy machinery from Switzerland and Sweden, drills from America, reactors from the Ukraine, plus a lot of old scavenged Soviet stuff, some of it good, some indescribably shoddy, but all of it unmatched, some of it even built in inches, so that they had to improvise constantly, building oil wells out of ice and string, knocking together nuclear reactors that made Chernobyl look like a Swiss watch. And every desperate day's work accomplished with a collection of tools that would have made a tinker weep. Now she could wander in the dim ruby light of sunset, Her old jazz collection piped from the Habitat stereo into her helmet headphones as she rooted in supply boxes and picked out any tool she wanted. She would carry them back to the small room she had commandeered in one of the storage warehouses, whistling along with King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, adding to a collection that included, among other items, oh wow, this is a serious Kim Stanley Robinson list, guys. Bear with me. That included, among other items, an Allen wrench set, some pliers, a power drill, several clamps, some hacksaws, an impact wrench set, a brace of cold-tolerant bungee cords, assorted files and rasps and planes, a crescent wrench set, a crimper, 5 hammers, some hemostats, 3 hydraulic jacks, a bellows, several sets of screwdrivers, drills and bits, a portable compressed gas cylinder, a box of plastic explosives and shape charges. Wow. I'm a fast reader like when I'm just reading, but it's interesting, but that is a lot. A tape measure, a giant Swiss Army knife, tin snips, tongs, tweezers, 3 vices, a wire stripper, X-Acto knives, a pick, a bunch of mallets, a nut driver set, hose clamps, a set of end mills, a set of jeweler's screwdrivers, a magnifying glass, all kinds of tape, a plumber's bob and ream, a sewing kit, scissors, sieves, a lathe, levels of all sizes, long-nosed pliers, vice grip pliers, a tap and die set, 3 shovels, a compressor, a generator, a welding and cutting set, a wheelbarrow, and so on. Woo! My! Wow, let's all take a moment. Okay.
What is the so on?
Dude, it's funny that he waited till there to put and so on. Let me take my background off so you can see this paragraph real quick. That was impressive. You thought the list in Oversea Under Stone and Simon's Pockets was a lot, but no. This is, let me see here. Okay, I'm going to put my fingers on both sides of it.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
I love that he didn't say so on earlier, though.
Yeah, right, same. I was like, all this, 2 paragraphs and stuff, and then a little more, I won't mention.
Yeah, this has all been leading up to a quiz, which will determine if you guys get to continue participating. As an interpreter, I've been working on my recall, and I feel that you guys, if you want to keep up with me, need to step it up a little bit. So let's see, Kevin, can you name 3 items in Nadia's personal kit?
Tongs, tweezers, and also needle nose pliers, which I thought was funny that they didn't mention that when they also mentioned tongs and tweezers.
You got it, baby. Tongs and tweezers are right next to each other. Good job. All right, Jordan. Now you got some brain food there. What are 3 items in this absurdly long list?
I got some cheese.
Some cheese?
Some cheese.
Wensleydale, Gromit.
Singly on this, there's various screwdrivers, drill driver, nuts and bolts, and
Yeah, you can basically think of anything from a hardware store, and you'll probably.
yeah. I'm like, let's see, what other tools do I have in the shop?
I think
Woo.
the nut driver was in there.
There's a sewing machine there. I remember that one.
Anyways, yeah, this
Levels and multiple tapes.
that was something else, guys. Thank you for bearing with me.
Man,
Yeah.
for all the pennies in the world, what cheese am I eating?
Okay, let me get a good look at it. It's definitely a sharper cheddar. It's aged. It's not too crumbly. It's not overly salty.
Cheddar?
Oh, is it just a big ass hunk of Parmesan?
Maybe.
It is, isn't it?
That was my guess.
It might be.
Awesome.
Find out next week. Oh, it's Reggiano Romano?
Yeah, yep.
That's my new underwear line, by the way. New from Reggiano Romano. The banana boat. All right, thank you guys. That was impressive. And so on. And this was just the mechanical equipment, her carpenter's tools. In other parts of the warehouse, they were stockpiling research and lab equipment, geological tools, and any number of computers and radios and telescopes and video cameras. And the biosphere team had warehouses of equipment to set up the farm, the waste recyclers, the gas exchange mechanism, in essence, their whole infrastructure. I think you'd be on the biosphere team, Jordy. And the medical team had more warehouses of supplies for the clinic and their research labs and the genetic engineering facility. You know what this is? Nadia said to Sax Russell one evening, looking around her warehouse. It is an entire town, disassembled and lying in pieces. And a very prosperous town at that. Yes, a university town, with first-rate departments in several sciences. But still in pieces. Yes, but I kind of like it that way. Sunset was mandatory, return to habitat time, and in the dusk she would stumble into the lock and inside and eat another small, cold meal sitting on her bed, listening to the talk around her, which mostly concerned the day's work, and the arrangement of the tasks for the next morning. Frank and Maya were supposed to be doing this, but in fact it was happening spontaneously, in a kind of ad hoc barter system. Hiroko was particularly good at it, which was a surprise given how withdrawn she had been on the voyage out. But now that she needed help from outside her team, she spent most of every evening moving from person to person, so single-minded and persuasive that she usually had a sizable crew working on the farm every morning. Nadia couldn't really see this. They had 5 years of dehydrated and canned food on hand, fare that suited Nadia fine. She had eaten worse for most of her life, and she paid little attention to food anymore. She might as well have been eating hay or refueling like one of the tractors. But they did need the farm for growing bamboo, which Nadia planned to use as a construction material in the permanent habitat that she hoped to start building soon. It all interlocked. All their tasks linked together, were necessary to each other. So when Hiroko plopped down beside her, she said, Yeah, be there at 8. But you can't build the permanent farm until the base habitat itself is built. So really you ought to be helping me tomorrow, right? No, Hiroko said, laughing. Day after, okay? Hiroko's main competition for labor came from Sax Russell and his crowd, who were working to start all the factories. Vlad and Ursula and the Biomed group were also hungry to get all their labs set up and running. These 3 teams seemed willing to live in the trailer park indefinitely, as long as their own projects were progressing. But luckily there were a lot of people who were not so obsessed by their work. People like Maya and John and the rest of the cosmonauts, who were interested in moving into larger and better protected quarters as soon as possible. So Nadia's project would get help from them. When she was done eating, Nadia took her tray into the kitchen and cleaned it with a little swab, then went over to sit by Anne Claiborne and Simon Fraser and the rest of the geologists. Anne looked nearly asleep. She was spending her mornings taking long rover trips and hikes, and then working hard on the base all afternoon, trying to make up for her trips away. To Nadia, she seemed strangely tense, less happy about being on Mars than one would have thought. She appeared unwilling to work on the factories, or for Hiroko. Indeed, she usually came to work for Nadia, who, since she was only trying to build housing, could be said to be impacting the planet less than the more ambitious teams. Maybe that was it, maybe not. Anne wasn't sane. She was hard to know, moody, not in Maya's extravagant Russian manner, but more subtly, and Nadia thought, in a darker register. All around them, people cleaned up after dinner and talked, and looked over manifests and talked, and bunched around computer terminals and talked, and washed clothes and talked, until most were stretched out on their beds, talking in lower voices until they passed out. "It's like the first second of the universe," Sax Russell observed, rubbing his face wearily. "All crammed together and no differentiation. Just a bunch of hot particles rushing about." Let's see here. Yeah, I'll read a little bit more if you guys are down. Give me an elaborate thumbs up if you had a decent day today. Oh wow, see, Kevin's was pretty creative, Jordan. You could learn a thing or two from him. I miss those feet. I always tell people Jordan has the best feet. It's just what I always tell people. Yeah, those are good looking. They look like they'd hold you up and everything. Keep you vertical.
Short dog. If the wheat trimming doesn't work out, or the wheat growing doesn't work out, you know, you can be a foot model, baby.
Foot model, yeah. George Costanza was a hand model, but I think of you more as a foot model.
That's right.
I've always said it. All right, well, let's keep going. That's an exciting time, though, to be those first weeks there. And that was just one day, and that was what it was like every day, for day after day after day. No change in the weather to speak of, except occasionally a wisp of cloud or an extra windy afternoon. In the main, the days rolled by one like the next. Everything took longer than planned. Just getting into the walkers and out of the habitats was a chore. And then all the equipment had to be warmed. And even though it had been built to a uniform set of standards, the international nature of the equipment meant that there were inevitable mismatches of size and function. And the dust. "Don't call it dust," Anne would complain. "That's like calling dust gravel. Call it fines. They're fines." The dust got into everything, and all the physical work in the penetrating cold was exhausting, so that they went slower than they thought they would, and began to collect a number of minor injuries. And finally, there was just an amazing number of things to do, some of which had never even occurred to them. It took them about a month, for instance, they had budgeted 10 days, just to open all the freight loads, check their contents, and move them into the appropriate stockpiles, to get to the point where they could really begin to work. After that, they could begin to build in earnest. And here Nadia came into her own. She had had nothing to do on the Aries. It had been a kind of hibernation for her. But building things was her great talent, the nature of her genius, trained in the bitter school of Siberia. Very quickly she became the colony's chief troubleshooter, the universal solvent, as John called her. Almost every job they had benefited from her help. And as she ran around every day answering questions and giving advice, she blossomed into a kind of timeless work heaven. So much to do, so much to do. Every night in the planning sessions, Hiroko worked her wiles, and the farm went up. 3 parallel rows of greenhouses, looking like commercial greenhouses back on Earth, except smaller and very thick-walled, to keep them from exploding like party balloons. Even with interior pressures of only 300 millibars, which was barely farmable, the differential with the outside was drastic. A bad seal or a weak spot, and they would go bang. But Nadia was good at cold weather seals, and so Hiroko was calling her in a panic every other day. Then the material scientists needed help getting their factories operational. and the crew assembling the nuclear reactor wanted her supervision for every breath that they took. They were petrified with fright that they would do something wrong, and were not reassured by Arcady sending radio messages down from Phobos, insisting they did not need such a dangerous technology, that they could get all the power they needed from wind generation. He and Phyllis had bitter arguments about this. It was Hiroko who cut Arcady off, and with what she said was a Japanese commonplace phrase. Shikata ga nai, meaning there is no other choice. Windmills might have generated enough power, as Arcady contended, but they didn't have windmills, while they had been supplied with a Rickover nuclear reactor built by the U.S. Navy and a beautiful piece of work. And no one wanted to try bootstrapping themselves into a wind-powered system. They were in too much of a hurry. Shikata ga nai. This too became one of their oft-repeated phrases. And so every morning, the construction crew for Chernobyl, Arcady's name, of course, begged Nadia to come out with them and supervise. They had been exiled far to the east of the settlement, so that it made sense to go out for a full day with them. But then the medical team wanted her help building a clinic and some labs inside from some discarded freight crates that they were converting into shelters. So instead of staying out at Chernobyl, she would go back midday to eat, and then help the med team. Every night she passed out exhausted. Some evenings before she did, she had long talks with Arcady up on Phobos. His crew was having trouble with the moon's microgravity, and he wanted her advice as well. If only we could get into some G just to live, to sleep, Arcady said. Build train tracks in a ring around the surface, Nadia suggested out of a doze. Make one of the tanks from the Ares into a train and run it around the track. Get on board and run the train around fast enough to give you some G against the ceiling of the train. Static, then Arcady's wild cackle. Nadezhda Francine, I love you. I love you. You love gravity. With all this advisory work, the construction of their permanent habitat went slowly indeed. It was only once a week or so that Nadia would climb into the open cab of a Mercedes and rumble over the torn ground to the end of the trench she had started. At this point, it was 10 meters wide, 50 meters long, and 4 deep, which was as deep as she wanted to go. The bottom of the trench was the same as the surface: clay, fines, rocks of all sizes. Regolith. While she worked with the bulldozer, the geologist hopped in and out of the hole, taking samples and looking around. Even Anne, who did not like the way they were ripping up the area. But no geologist ever born could keep away from a land cut. Nadia listened to the conversation band as she worked. They figured the regolith was probably much the same all the way down to bedrock, which was too bad. Regolith was not Nadia's idea of good ground. At least its water content was low, less than 0.1%, which meant that they wouldn't get much slumping under a foundation, one of the constant nightmares of Siberian construction. When she got the regolith cut right, she was going to lay a foundation of Portland cement, the best concrete they could make with the materials at hand. It would crack unless they poured it 2 meters thick, but shikata ga nai. The thickness would provide some insulation. But she would have to box the mud and heat it to get it to cure. It wouldn't below 13 degrees centigrade, so that meant heating elements. Slow, slow. Everything was slow. She drove the dozer forward to lengthen the trench, and it bit the ground and bucked. Then the weight of the thing told, and the scoop cut through the regolith and plowed forward. What a pig, Nadia said to the vehicle fondly. Nadia's in love with a bulldozer, Maya said over their band. At least I know who I'm in love with, Nadia mouthed. She had spent too many of the evenings of the last week out in the tool shed with Maya, listening to her rattle away about her problems with John, about how she really got along in most ways better with Frank, about how she couldn't decide what she felt, and was sure Frank hated her now, etc., etc., etc. Cleaning tools, Nadia had said, da, 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 trying to hide her lack of interest. The truth was she was tired of Maya's problems and would rather have discussed building materials or almost anything else. A call from the Chernobyl crew interrupted her bulldozing. Nadia, how can we get cement this thick to set in the cold? Heat it. We are. Heat it more. Oh. They were almost done out there, Nadia judged. The rickover had been mostly pre-assembled. It was a matter of putting the forms together, fitting in the steel containment tank, filling the pipes with water, which dropped their supply to nearly nothing, wiring it all up, piling sandbags around it all, and pulling the control rods. After that, they would have 300 kilowatts on hand, which would put an end to the nightly argument over who got the lion's share of generator power the next day. There was a call from Sachs. One of the Sabatier processors had clogged, and they couldn't get the housing off it. So Nadia left the bulldozing to John and Maya and took a rover to the factory complex to have a look. I'm off to see the alchemists, she said. Have you ever noticed how much the machinery here reflects the character of the industry that built it? Sachs remarked to Nadia as she arrived and went to work on the Sabatier. If it was built by car companies, it's low-powered but reliable. If it was built by the aerospace industry, it's outrageously high-powered but breaks down twice a day. And partnership products are horribly designed, Nadia said. Right. And chemical equipment is finicky, Spencer Jackson added. I'll say, especially in this dust. The Boeing air miners had been only the start of the factory complex. Their gases were fed into big boxy trailers to be compressed and expanded and rendered and recombined, using chemical engineering operations such as dehumidification, liquefaction, fractional distillation, electrolysis, electrosynthesis. Slowly they worked up more and more complex chemicals, which flowed from one factory to the next through a warren of